These are the top 5 Stephen King audiobooks of all time. Welcome back to another edition of Drotalks Audiobooks. Dro here, and today we're going to be going over the top 5 Stephen King audiobooks of all time. I haven't listened to every Stephen King audiobook, so your favorite may not be on this list, but stay tuned for books that you definitely need to check out. But before we begin, prevent the collapse of our reality by giving a like to this video, join the dark side, and subscribe for more audiobook content. Number 5. Christene, narrated by Holter Graham. The classic tale of a boy and his car, except when Stephen King gets involved, you can bet there will be blood. The story revolves around two individuals, Arnie Cunningham and Dennis Gilder. Arnie, who is an awkward teenager, and his first car, a 1957 Buick Fury, and how this event impacts not only his life, but his relationship to our next protagonist, Dennis Gilder, who is his best friend, who is much more popular, much more better looking, and has a life a little bit easier than good old Arnie does. And this tale is probably one of Stephen King's more tragic tales, as we see Arnie, this good-natured, lovable young man, delve into a despair of obsession over the 1957 Buick Fury. As we see Arnie transform and become more obsessed with his car, and we see the car go from a rust bucket to a pristine automobile, and this obsession take hold in a very terrifying manner, and we see how it completely destroys Arnie Cunningham's life, and Dennis, being the great best friend that he is, doing all that he can to intervene between his friend and this lethal obsession. This has one of the best endings out of any Stephen King story. Anyone that likes cars will like this story, and this is actually very terrifying. One of classic Stephen King's and one of his best, and an audiobook that you need to check out. Number 4, 11/22/63, narrated by Craig Wasson. There have been many watershed moments throughout history, and a pivotal one was the assassination of JFK. Never has there been an event that defined a generation more so, and also wrapped around so much mystery as to who was behind it. And if you had a chance to go back in time and solve this mystery and prevent this moment, would you? Well, Stephen King thought about it. He created a time travel story to prove this point. Now, time travel is very hard to pull off. It can easily get convoluted. But Stephen King, he don't waste no time with that. He puts a portal in a pantry and boom, you go back to 1957. And every time you use that portal, you reset anything that you made in time. Simple, precise, and effective. Because even though time travel is the main plot device in this story, the story itself supersedes that. It's about a man lost in time trying to uncover a mystery, prevent a watershed moment, and the relationships that he builds in the process. It has one of the coolest endings. It took me by surprise. I did not expect it to end the way it did, and I highly recommend you check out this audiobook. Number 3, The Shining, narrated by Campbell Scott. I believe this is one of Stephen King's most pivotal audiobooks. The main reason being is, even though Stephen King has delved in the realm of psychic and supernatural before this is the first book where he actually gives a name to it, The Shining. It's the center point of this book, and it becomes a centerpiece of all the books that he has written afterwards in some form or aspect. The Shining is pivotal to the Dark Tower series, and it all begins here. Now, this book with a man, down on his luck rider, that heads to a small retreat, hotel in the Colorado mountains, takes his wife and family, and gets obsessed and possessed by the supernatural elements in this hotel, and it drives him crazy, and he becomes a monster throughout the process. Stanley Kubrick did a great movie of this, but the ending in that movie, although fits with that movie, is not even close, does not hold a candle to the ending in the book. The ending in the book makes this story one of my favorite Stephen King stories of all time. And the sequel, Dr. Sleep, in my opinion, is even better. So if you want fundamental Stephen King, you got to check out The Shining. Number 2, The Dark Tower series, narrated by Frank Muller and George Goodall. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. This is Stephen King's magnum opus. This is his largest tale that he's ever told, and it encompasses elements from so many of his other books. As I mentioned earlier, The Shining is prevalent in this, but so are so many other stories. So many other characters that make appearances here, from Salem's Lot to It, Insomnia. All of these stories, even The Stand, is prevalent in this series. It's a fantastic story and has my favorite opening line out of any book I've ever read or listened to. This is Stephen King at his best, and it's so good that we follow Roland and his group of travelers as they're going to save the Dark Tower or prevent a catastrophe that will bring down all realities. And in one book, they sit down at a campfire and he starts telling a tale about his youth. Stephen King is so good that when that happened, I just wanted to continue the story that we were being told. I didn't want to listen to a campfire story. Halfway into that campfire story, I couldn't get enough. This just goes to show how well Stephen King is, how adept he is at world building and fleshing out characters. There is some breaking of the fourth wall, fifth wall, sixth wall in this series, and this is a definite must listen to anyone that enjoys Stephen King. Number 1, Salem's Lot, narrated by Ron McLarty. I know what you're thinking. Out of all the Stephen King books and audiobooks, why Salem's Lot? This was his second published book, but if I'm not mistaken, I believe this was the first book he has ever written. It's loosely based on Dracula, which for me is one of my favorite classical stories, right up there with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And Stephen King, in my opinion, does it justice. It's a great retelling of Dracula in modern day. I guess if you can call 1970s modern day. But it is fantastic. Never have the characters felt so real to me. The world so terrifying. The ultimatums, the conflict so suspenseful. And man, did this really open the world of Stephen King to me. This was the first book I ever read of Stephen King. It was also the first audiobook I ever listened to of Stephen King. And this was the one that made me a lifelong Stephen King fan. There's no doubt in my mind that classic Stephen King is better than current Stephen King. But even so, current Stephen King does put out some great stories. As I mentioned, Dr. Sleep is fantastic. The short stories, If It Bleeds, are great. So classic Stephen King is still there. And he makes appearances every now and again. And it all started for me with Salem's Lot. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of this, there are probably titles that you're wondering where they are. Where's Carrie? Where's Pet Sematary? Where's Needful Things? Well, I haven't read or listened to every Stephen King audiobook. I do plan to do my most recommended Stephen King audiobooks. So if you would like your book featured and it wasn't featured here, comment below. Let me know what that book is. I'll compile that list and we'll look forward to that video in the future. But as always, thank you for watching. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe. Ring that bell to get notified. And we'll see you next time.